war, protests, human rights abuses, elections, politicians and peace talks. From Syria to Ukraine, Iraq to Afghanistan, societies facing complex challenges have highly visible symbols of change. These symbols dominate our headlines, fill news feeds, and shape perceptions about these countries' problems and possible solutions. These are the visible symptoms of a society experiencing crisis or transition, which are related to but not the same as the underlying causes. Like bacteria in the body or cancers that grow unseen to the naked eye, the pathology of a society is often invisible or hidden in complexity and can therefore remain untreated. Our efforts to tackle social problems in our countries or others often focus on treating what's visible rather than underlying causes. So we're better at providing food stamps, but we're not so good at combating poverty. We're good at looking after refugees, but often fail to prevent war. If we're not aware of the underlying patterns of pathology, our efforts to help can sometimes inadvertently sustain the condition or make it worse. This is the case with an addict, for example, whose self-medication merely reinforces the underlying pattern of dependence. In systems thinking, this is known as a balancing loop, a pattern of causal relationships that serves to maintain rather than change the status quo. This talk is about the invisible forces that shape outcomes in peace and reform processes. Drawing upon examples from Myanmar, we will talk about the need to reveal and act upon hidden patterns in order to break down the underlying pathology of a system. Myanmar has had its fair share of symbolic changes over the past few years. Thousands of political prisoners released, Nobel laureates out of jail and in politics, peace agreements, the first democratic elections in half a century, an economic boom, but also religious conflict, ongoing armed violence, and protests. The changes of the last few years have been startling, considering the country was frozen under authoritarian rule and civil war for 60 years. But the question is whether the underlying pathology is actually being treated. Let's first consider what the people in Myanmar really want to change. Like other societies transitioning from authoritarianism to democracy, if you simplify it, Myanmar's people want to change from a system in which a few powerful people dominate power and resources to one in which political power and economic resources are shared peacefully, justly, and democratically. To understand whether this is happening, we are going to use systems mapping to examine the relationship between visible and hidden changes in the country over the past few years. From 2010 to 2012, the government implemented a series of highly visible reforms. Optimism was high at this time, and in response, international sanctions were lifted, opening the gates for much-needed international investment and assistance. In 2012, efforts to generate more just and inclusive politics have been mixed. The 2015 elections were seen as a triumph for democracy. The people's will was respected, ushering in the first truly civilian government in half a century. But the military remains careful to ensure that its interests are not threatened. People who speak out against it continue to be arrested. In the peace process, the military refuses to concede to opposition demands and continues to attack and/or exclude some groups. Meanwhile, the Constitution, which guarantees the military a powerful ongoing role in politics, has yet to be changed. This carefully calibrated political process is represented here by the crossed arrows, which indicate increased political power sharing with important limitations. There has indeed been positive progress, but there's more to Myanmar's underlying pathology than politics. Is the former regime really giving up power, or is the nature of power just being transformed? To answer this, we must examine our first hidden pattern, which is economic. So if we look at the economy, it's significant that much of Myanmar's state assets were sold before 2010 to a limited set of domestic buyers. This was a closed tender process with little scrutiny, and has created an economy dominated by a few military-linked or controlled conglomerates. The country has low transparency rankings and high corruption. Much economic activity remains off the books. Jade, for example, was 34 million in revenues in 2012, but reputable estimates put the trade at 8 billion. It's also a society dominated by patronage, which essentially means that revenues tend to flow upwards towards people in power. So if we relate this to politics and the economy, after international re-engagement in 2012, there's been a dramatic increase in foreign investment. While economic development is much needed, if an investment was serving to address a critical structural problem of highly concentrated resources, new money would be serving Myanmar's poor. But this is not what's happening. Rather, it's mostly those at the top, those that set up the game, that are prospering, which by and large are the same people that were sanctioned and derided as tyrants by much of the international community just a few years ago. Most investors didn't purposely intend to benefit the country's former dictators, but when they put their money in, because the formal and informal rules that govern the economy are largely invisible, such unintended consequences have become possible. This is illustrated here by the dotted line, indicating that wealth creation in its current form is undermining rather than supporting a fairer distribution of resources. Another example of a hidden pattern that inadvertently supports a dominant power holder is found in international support to strengthen health and education services. Aid funding has increased to Myanmar significantly over the last few years. Under the standard aid model, most of this support goes to and through the government. So for health and education, this means strengthening systems and policies, training more teachers and health workers, building more schools and clinics. And that sounds good, but unfortunately not, or at least not in terms of power and resource sharing. Ethnic armed groups, which are negotiating with the government for peace in Myanmar, have for decades provided parallel health and education services in the areas the government does not control. Their vision for the peace process is the emergence of a federal state system. The problem with much of the international aid funding for health and education is that it goes to and through the government, starving the non-state system of resources and reinforcing aspects of Myanmar's underlying pathology, the tendency of power holders from the center of the country to try and dominate groups from the peripheries. This is depicted here by another dotted line to power and resource sharing. International aid can inadvertently cause harm when it doesn't recognize or cannot act upon this hidden pattern. The system's perspective merely recommends a reprioritization for local and international efforts. In business and politics, it's about more checks and balances on power. Independent media must be protected and able to compete against private interests. Civil society and government transparency initiatives need increased financing, technical assistance, cohesion, and technology transfer to shine a light on corrupt and irresponsible business practice, particularly in relation to natural resources. Returning to our systems diagram, this reprioritization is illustrated by a line of support from international aid to civil society actors, allowing them to play their balancing role, particularly by ensuring that hidden economic power remains in check. Responsible business can also be encouraged from the outside. International investment policies and sanctions regimes should be calibrated to ensure that new economic activity is transparent and diversifies the beneficiaries from Myanmar's growing economy, diverting investment from stakeholders that have been implicated in conflict or corruption previously. Changing the way that we deliver international aid so that it does not work primarily to and through government will be harder. Countries need to relax their policies so that they can more easily support non-state actors, recognizing that their investment can and should influence a fairer balance of power. Fundamentally, the required changes that are being outlined are about supporting the emergence of alternative coexisting power centers. Together, a vibrant civil society, citizen engagement, ethnic administrations, and the democratic opposition can counterbalance the control of traditional state, economic, and military power holders, creating a fairer, more stable society. This is the key. The potential impacts of these efforts, animated here together, is to generate a reinforcing loop, a pattern of causal dynamics that serves to alter the status quo so that power and resources are shared rather than concentrated in the hands of a few. Alone, any of these efforts might fail, but together they could fundamentally shift the nature of power relations in Myanmar.